Hello everyone, it's Jamarl Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So let's talk about a progressive manifesto. Let's try that. I've been writing on this for a few months and I haven't had time to sit down and do it because I've been doing videos. But I've done videos on it and I've somewhat crystallized my thoughts on this. It was funny when Ibn Kim mentioned, he says, hey, it would be nice if we had something that kind of espouses the values of what this is. Because anybody can call themselves progressives. That's kind of the problem. Co-opting. What does it mean? It doesn't mean anything yet. So that makes it somewhat difficult to put your hands around it. People often ask me, what does it mean to be progressive? What does it mean for X as opposed to Y? I'd argue that you go with a different word just to distinguish yourself. You call it Neo-progressivism. The reason I say that is calling it progressive has been co-opted. Neo-progressivism, I'd argue, can be very specific to a particular set of objectives, which can easily delineate whether the person is or is not. Get rid of the subjectivity. Either you are or you're not. You're on the bus or you're off. So the first part, philosophical basis. Why? What does it mean? What's the point? What is, I guess if you want to call it an ideology, but what's the basis of it? Because I would argue any particular party, any particular belief system should be based on something, right? I mean, what, you're Democrat and Republican just to be a Democrat and Republican? Or is there a philosophical basis that governs how you behave? I'm saying that needs to be established because anything else that comes out of it needs to arise from that. We have a fundamental problem in our society. And in every society that's gone down the line. Human beings, as awesome and terrifying as we could potentially be, are born missing things. In order for us to be that awesome, optimal person, to be self-actualized, we need things that we ourselves cannot just spontaneously generate. This means that there is this idea of natural labor. You need food, you need shelter, you need clean water, nutritious food, but clean water. You need to have this sense of self-worth, in a sense. Those things aren't necessarily inherently given to you. That means there's socially necessary labor. Somebody needs to get those things in order for you to persist yourself. As the society gets more complex, you have another problem. Who's going to build those buildings? Who's going to dig those ditches? Who's going to do all the things that allow us to have a modern society? Well, they've come up with pretty disgusting solutions. Serfdom, slavery, worker, and consumer. I tie those two together because essentially one feeds into the other. But ultimately, one worked on the land. Another one also worked on the plantation. The other one also works on a plantation. The difference is he gets to choose his particular plantation. Now, this answers the problem of who's going to do the labor. Now, it answers this in a monstrous way, though. In serfdom and in slavery, for the most part, you had chains and whips. You just beat the person into submission to force them to do your will. In our system, it's more refined. It's no longer as vulgar as that. We're going to focus on your frailties. Those things that I mentioned that we needed to be the optimum human being, we're going to attack those items. So if you don't do what we say, or if you don't do what you need to do, meaning if you don't choose a plantation, you're not going to have food. You're not going to have water. You're not going to have shelter. You're not going to have this idea of sense of fulfillment because you're going to be castigated by the society to which you find yourself. So this is right off the bat, you can see the issue. If you have a situation where people have needs and you have a system that attacks those needs, what happens to the individual when that person doesn't have their needs met? Isn't that an interesting question? And isn't it an operative question if you're going to have a system that actively attacks those needs? I'd argue that the society you have today with crime and war, poverty, with even psychological illnesses, with people dying early, with stress-related deaths, those things are aspects of the model. Because that model attacks the things that people need to be self-actualized and an optimum human being. If you're attacking what's needed to be an optimum human being, then you're probably not going to be an optimum human being. When these politicians get up there and have these conversations about freedom and justice and all this other stuff, and their hand on their heart and they're bleeding on the flag, and it's like, I'll die on this flag for America. They're not talking about you. Freedom in a capitalistic society is resolved for capital. Capital is the highest virtue. It's in the name. Capitalism. Capitalist. Capital is the highest virtue. Meaning, the range of your decision space in a capitalistic society is governed by how much capital you have, how much money you have in your pocket, what you're going to go, what you're going to do, what you're going to eat, where you're going to see, where you're going to take your vacations, what you're going to drive. All those things are governed by capital, how much cash you can accrue and have in your pocket. Half of the country is in poverty. Half of the country is in poverty. If you're in poverty, what is your decision space? 50 hours a week, 60 hours a week. Is that a life? If you're working 50 or 60 hours a week and you're chained to a particular job, just making ends meet, nothing special, you're barely making ends meet, you're chained to that particular job that you absolutely despise, 50 hours a week. That's amazing. And yes, you get your choice of Coke, Pepsi, McDonald's, Burger King, and everything else. So you can take that check and you can buy other things. But ultimately, you're chained to something that you don't particularly like. And you spend the majority of your week doing things that you don't particularly like. Or majority of your waking week anyway. So no, you're not a slave. You are not a serf. You're something different. But in being something different, you're also something very similar. Is that what you want your life to be? And is that what human life, is that all there is to human life? What does it mean to be free in a capitalistic society? I would wager, or I would say the unassailable point, that freedom is reserved for those with capital, because that's the only way you will be able to express it in a capitalistic society. You're constrained by what you have in your wallet. That's what it boils down to. If you have massive wallets, that constraint goes away. You're free. Do whatever the hell you want, including influence and political power. Now, the point I'm getting at is, for the 99% of the population, that's workers, struggle, the poor, the indebted. For that population, 99% of that population are either not making it, barely making it, just over making it, but full well understand that at any point they can fall down into the other ladders. Completed with stress. In one of the lectures I sat in on, they found that your income is some degree is determinant on how long you would live. That's amazing. Meaning people with 50,000, 70,000, 80,000, 100,000, million, 50 million. And it wasn't even the situation of people where, like between, let's say if you had 1 million, then your life goes, no, even there, those people died earlier than people who had 10 million. Stress. Or their estimate, I'm saying stress. You're in a capitalistic society where you know full well that at any point you can fall down the bottom rung and you can exist in scarcity. You've bound this idea of cash, this unreal thing, with human need. Meaning it's not about the individual anymore. It's about the capital. It was the fall of man. Now, I'd argue that in our particular society, that principle of scarcity allows one side of the population to control the majority of the population. When slavery ended, a new form of it began on the rest of the population. Capital. Hey, we don't have to just stick with these black guys. We can have the whole society, 99% of the society, and we can control them, not by a whip and a chain, but we can control them by cash. We have it, they don't. If they want to eat, they're going to get it from us. Meaning, to some degree, you've given the elites a certain amount of control over the rest of the population, purely based on scarcity of the individual. Not having something to eat, not being able to take care of your kid, not being able to take care of your wife, pay your house note. Those things are big fucking deals. Like, so you can imagine the terror of somebody losing their job. If that person has a house note, a wife, a new kid, is that person going to go out and protest? Probably not. Probably not. I would argue that if you're going to be a progressive, you need to deal with that issue. Meaning, you need to deal with this idea of freedom. I'd argue that your platform should be freedom for the individual. Not in some hokey way, but in real legislative terms. How can I help this person be free? How can I help them to be free? How do you do it? And the point I'm making is, if you go with that idea, there's certain things that extend from that particular idea of human dignity and liberty. Meaning, I want that particular person to be emancipated. I want that person to be able to live a self-actualized life because they have the things that they need to be self-actualized. And in those people being self-actualized, meaning in that society, helping that person to be the best of who they are, I myself also allow myself to be the best of who I am. It's mutual. It's not dog eat dog. It's not you trying to vulture a person from the time they're born to the time they die. It's not that. It's a different society in which you're looking at and says, how can we exalt human potential? I'd argue that freedom is the basis of that. But that's the position you need to take in regards to the fundamental basis of your party. And the legislation that exists from that should work towards self-actualization. You never have to utter the words capitalism. But ultimately, you full well understand that what we're talking about is changing the model itself. Emancipation in this particular answer, again, comes from this idea of breaking this idea of scarcity of the individual in their lives. You want that person to be free, but that person can never be free if at any particular time he can have his needs stripped away from him, or have the things that would supply his needs stripped away from him. The elites will always have a certain measure of control if those people have a certain level of security. That's the crux of the debate in regards to progressivism, or I would say that's the crux of what you're focusing on. How do you help the individual to be free? I would argue the first point is elimination of poverty. Universal basic income, federal jobs guarantee should be the top thing on the list. That person who's working at Walmart should not be stuck working at Walmart. Meaning, if Walmart is not going to pay that person a decent wage, that person can quit that job and get a job with the federal government earning a basic minimum wage, maybe $15 an hour. You right off the bat force everybody else to compete, or at the very least raise their rates to deal with that particular rate that the federal government is paying. Because at any point, those people can leave and get a job with the federal government. You've destroyed this idea of having these people completely subordinate to private enterprise. That person, if that person has the capacity to work, will always have their needs met. Federal jobs guarantee. Universal basic income takes it to this degree of if that person cannot necessarily afford to work, at the very least, they're getting a basic stipend. Whatever that is. You can call it a wealth tax. You can call it whatever you want. But ultimately, you're looking at it from the standpoint of how do we destroy this yoke that are on people? Now, if that person is working at Walmart, and we have 50% of the people working low-wage jobs, is that person going to bitch about getting a certain stipend? Now, the argument I'd make in this case is the resources of this particular country belong to the people of this country. Because those resources belong to the people of this country, there will be a tax on those resources. Because ultimately, there was nobody here to give those resources away. Any resource that is being used in the United States, some of that profit should go back to the individuals who are in this particular country, because it is all of our resources. It's common heritage. It is not there for private enterprise to rape away. Who gave them that authority to take those resources in that way? Like, I guess what I'm getting at is, any resource that was taken was done so at the end of a sword or a gun. At which point do we allow bullies to just strip away things from people and keep that and identify it as their property? I steal your car and I say it's my car now. At which point does that fly? And yet, every day we walk around doing things and we accept that private enterprise can take resources that nobody could honestly give them and extract massive amounts of wealth from those resources and privatize those gains. I'm saying those resources are common heritage. Sarah Palin did the same thing in Alaska. I'm saying the same thing should be done in all of the United States. And that money should be given back as a tax or as a UBI to the people in this country. And to go beyond that, the tax on financial transactions, those micro transactions that go micro, fast, Put a tax on that. Those things are driving up the prices of stocks. I'd put in one policy after the next in order to secure the people of the country. Democrats have been talking about it for 40, 50 years. I'm saying actually do something about it. The plans in this country that are most successful, Social Security and Medicare, they were designed to work. They're popular because they were designed to work. I'm saying you can do the same thing with the universal basic income and the jobs program. Now, with the jobs program, I would say the next step would be free college tuition. Part of the money that you're going to make off of that, I can't exact the name for it, but getting a tax on that particular financial transactions can go towards paying for college for each and every person in this particular country. You've decapitated this idea of being able to rape a 16-year-old, 18-year-old for $50,000. Destroy that process. That person can now get an education, and that person is not preyed upon in order to get that education. An education, by the way, that will help the government to which that person exists in. You dealt with poverty. You dealt with this idea of education. Single pill healthcare. The time somebody's born to the time they die, they have healthcare. Figure out how to do it. The money is there for it. You just need to prioritize the money for it. Where are your priorities? Hey, how about taking $300 billion from murdering people abroad? You can find the money for it. You always find the money for it when you want to kill somebody. You can find the money when you want to save somebody. Next step. These wars abroad. Bring them to an end. We're not going to be gallivanting around the globe murdering people. That ends. Period. Period. Solar power. Meaning, you're not just going towards this idea of freedom, freeing the person in regards to education and health. No, keep going. Solar power. We're going to put solar panels on each person's house. Or at the very least, give massive discounts in getting those things installed. And I would argue that part of the federal jobs guarantee, in the same way that the government built the highway system, should assist in putting those panels on people's houses. Now, the reason I say that is if you can get that person to where that person no longer needs to pay an energy bill, you've emancipated that person from its energy donors. You're literally having energy freedom. That person has his house. If that person's house is paid for, he doesn't have to pay for energy anymore. That is done just by natural means. One policy after the next goes with this idea of how do we exalt the human being? How do we help the individual to be free? I would argue that should be neo-progressivism. That should be the policy. Screw this New Deal stuff. The New Deal failed because the New Deal, for the most part, ran up against the capitalistic model that was trying to accrue more profit and consistently attacked that plan. I'm saying rip out the planks of that particular system. One policy after the next. Keep going. In the same way, you're going to have these federal workers because you're going to get a huge influx of workers. Allow those people to go into food deserts and build gardens that would allow food to be built. Meaning you have a building. That building isn't doing anything. That building is somewhat condemned. Build that building up. Turn that into a facility that allows plants to be on each of the floors in that building. Automate each and every process in that building so maybe one person needs to oversee it. And allow people to get free or extremely low-cost food. Yes, you're still existing in the capitalistic model, but in one policy after the next, you're undermining the planks of control in that model, meaning you're trying to allow each person to be free. You're removing the stress of life. I'd argue that if you're going to have a progressive vision, that should be your vision. None of this stuff that they talk about in Washington, screw that. You're there to undermine the planks of the system itself, and you do so by taking one policy after the next that frees up the individual to be the individual. Automation. You strive to automate each and every process that you can automate, particularly of socially necessary labor. Each and every process. Meaning, you get to the point where society is built around what the individual wants to do because their needs are met. Not because somebody else is doing those needs, but because many of those needs are automated. If a person wants to take a position, let that person take the position that that person wants to take. But it's not done so because he's being compelled to some vulgar way to do it. Some kind of cattle prod is pushing the person along. Your argument is freedom. That's your argument. That's the word that you're taking. You're reappropriating that word from conservatives. Yes, this borders on libertarianism, but it's smart libertarianism. How can I be free? I want to be left to my own devices. I don't want to be forced to be a fry cook if I don't need to be a fry cook. If my needs are met, then I want my needs are met, and I want to be able to do whatever I want to do. So yes, I can go back to school because school is free. Yes, if I get injured, I'm going to go to the hospital because that is provided by the society itself. Certainly, you can see this as a better society. Yes, you're going to have a green new energy deal because you don't have a choice but to have a green new energy deal. Part of that green new energy is the solar panels and the installation of those solar panels and the decoupling individuals from their power companies. You do two things. You improve the environment and you provide freedom. I mean, you can understand, I'm not going to go through everything, but you can understand how this line of logic goes. You are trying to free up processes, that the things that people need. You're trying to supply the needs of individuals using automation. Use as few people as you possibly can. Free up the people in that particular society. The jobs that people take on are going to be jobs they want to take on, not because they need to take on. The systems in our particular society will revolve around that individual being self-actualized, not compelling the individuals to work. So yes, you may work until you're 40. You may work till you're 30, but not until you're 60. Not until you're 60. There will be social things in our particular society that will provide incentives for the person to work. Not these vulgar incentives, but incentives for the person to work. Because whether you want to believe it or not, in many of these other systems, there needs to be something. Like for instance, if you have a heinous task that needs to be done, even in a complex automated society, there are still things that need to be done. How do you compel people to do that? I would argue you can't come up with a system to compel people to do it, or at the very least incentivize people to do it without this vulgar compulsion. I'm saying you have a better society. This isn't mythic. This is legislation. One legislative thing after another, with an overall agenda in mind in changing the society itself. I would argue that's neo-progressivism. I would argue if somebody's calling themselves a progressive and everything else, that should be the bar to which they're held against. We can argue about it, we can bitch about it. This is my position, or at the very least, this is where I stake out my position. I would prefer to go further. Everything is common heritage. Yes, you're going to have belongings and everything else, but again, like I make the point of resources, there was nobody here to give anybody anything. Nobody. Somebody would have had to be here at the beginning and says, here. Meaning, just from a logic standpoint, all of these things are common heritage. Those resources were nobody's to give. They were nobody's to sell. If you're going to use them, you need to give that back to everybody else. That's pretty left wing, but the argument is sound. The argument is absolutely sound. I would argue that's neo-progressivism. And I would argue if you're going to go in a route, that's the direction to go. Your goal is not to draw, your goal is to win. The New Deal was a compromise in order to ensure capitalism. I have no such compromise in mind. I have no such compromise in mind. I am talking about a complete fundamental revolutionary change in our society done through political means, through one legislative process at the time without ever once uttering the word capitalism. That's what I'm talking about. So I'll leave it at that. All right, guys, if you enjoyed the content, feel free to share, like, subscribe, and you can always support the work through Patreon. Thank you.